Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. In a relatively brief period of time here, what I hope to do is talk about sovereignty and its importance over the last 35 years, what's going on in the United States, and what the United States and the United Kingdom need to do going forward. So I will go quickly, but I'm happy to answer questions afterward. And I should say, by way of confession, that my earliest introduction in international diplomacy came in large measure during the George H.W. Bush administration when I was in charge of UN affairs at the State Department under Jim Baker. And back in those days, when the Cold War was ending, we actually had a great deal of success in the United Nations. We repealed the infamous 1975 UN General Assembly resolution that declared Zionism to be a form of racism. In the Security Council, after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, we passed resolution after resolution, ultimately authorizing the use of force to drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait, the first time in 40 years that the UN Security Council had authorized the use of force, the prior time being in 1950 to oppose North Korea's invasion of South Korea. So I don't come at the international system inherently skeptical, although I'm more than skeptical today. I was there when there was actually a chance that it might prove successful or useful. But what I saw over time, as I think probably many, if not everybody in this room saw, was the mobilization really against the West as a whole of the concept of international law to be used against us, not against our adversaries. I watched what's called customary international law be taken over not by state practice, which was the original concept for customary international law, but taken over by left-wing academics who started writing it on their own. They were discovering these principles and deciding that we had to abide by them. Now, there was also in the US at this time, and I'm now in the early to mid 1990s, really not much understanding of what was happening in Europe. We still quaintly called the European project, we called it the common market. And it sounded to us that a continental common market was a pretty good idea. We didn't really understand fully, although I did see in my early days in the first Bush administration signs of this when in UN matters, where regional groups often caucus together to decide what positions to take, in meetings of the Western group, there would be times when some European member would say, well, we've reached the limit of the European Union position. We need to confer among ourselves. And so like children being sent out into the hall in school for doing something wrong in class, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, which were considered part of the Western group, had to stand outside the Western group while the EU decided what its position was. It wasn't the EU then, but it told me a lot about I thought what the way the European version of this would work out. And then I have to say, in the mid 1990s, I met Bill Cash and Ian Duncan Smith and some others who certainly alerted me to what was going on in a much more comprehensive way. And what was obvious to me at that point, from the mid 1990s, that the EU's fundamental problem was a lack of democratic accountability. Something, as far as I can tell, has only gotten worse with time. And I will say also, 20 years after roughly meeting Bill and Ian and so many others, I was here in Britain on referendum day in 2016 and was in, I think, Westminster Tower over on the other side of the river doing some TV broadcasts back to the United States when who should I run into but Dan Hannan, who took me a few floors down from that broadcast studio to be in the Vote Leave headquarters, which was a real thrill for me, almost as much of a thrill as watching citizens of this country vote for their independence from the European Union. Now, during this period of time, when we were in exile in the United States, looking toward what became the George W. Bush administration, many of critics of mine and others who thought like I did called our policy unilateralist as opposed to multilateralist, which of course we all know is better, at least if you're in the right circles. And I think we were unilateralists, certainly compared to what was going on in Europe. But here's the critical point. We were, and these bumper sticker definitions have always troubled me, but it takes too long to explain not to use them. While we were unilateralist, we were internationalist. We were not isolationist. George W. Bush, before he ran for president, called it a distinctly American internationalism, which was, I think, an accurate description, at the core of which, in many respects, was our concern for sovereignty. And to take you back to that period in the 1990s and early 2000s, there really was a large effort going on to try to diminish national sovereignty, particularly in the EU, which was the vanguard of the proletariat, you might say, but in many, many other respects, to reduce national discretion, to reduce the democratic authority of citizens in countries that had representative governments. So, for example, one thing that this intellectual approach tried to say was all treaties are reductions in sovereignty, and therefore you can't object to some without objecting to them all. And if you accept some, you should accept them all. So if the U.S. is a member of NATO, that's a treaty alliance that reduces U.S. sovereignty. So why not be part of the United Nations or other institutions which are trying to restrain that sovereignty? It seemed to me self-evident that voluntary association, which goes back through all of recorded human history, is very, very different than an association that you join that begins to make rules that bind you whether you agree with it or not. This is something that really permeates the EU experience. And I think that that's something that you can also see in a variety of international judicial projects which pretend that you can create courts in the international environment and that they'll act just like national courts, with a few small problems like no means of enforcement, no common standards, no real agreement on what the direction of travel is going to be. You can see things like the Law of the Sea Convention, which sets up an international tribunal that's only supposed to regulate the global commons, but ends up regulating discharges in rivers and countries that eventually make its way to the sea, that purports to put binding decisions on members of the Law of the Sea Treaty, which the United States, thank goodness, has never ratified. And this is part of the process. It's a fake court making fake decisions with the key objective of diminishing national sovereignty, bit by bit, decision by decision, that you don't really participate in. Same is true of the dispute resolution mechanism of the World Trade Organization, and most offensively, in my view, the International Criminal Court, which purports to hold individuals of member states to account. This is a clear reach from the international organization through the member states directly to their individual citizens. These were among the phenomena that were working in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But it also became clear that there were a lot of other efforts to bind nations, to limit their discretion, limit their ability to carry out the legitimate views of their peoples. That there were really treaties for the sake of treaties, especially in the area of arms control, whose objective by some of the participants was to undermine national defense, to make it harder, certainly for democratic countries, to be able to defend themselves. And one of the things that we did in the George W. Bush administration was begin to break through that mythology. So one of my proudest moments was being the lead negotiator for President Bush to withdraw the United States from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, so that U.S. And its friends could create national missile defense systems. We were told at the time, but the anti-ballistic missile treaty is the cornerstone of international strategic stability. If you withdraw from it, everything will dissolve into chaos. And led by then Senator Joe Biden, the argument was anti-missile missiles will never be successful. They said, you can't hit a bullet with a bullet. Well, if you've looked at the Middle East or the skies over Ukraine today, you see bullets are hitting bullets all the time. And thank goodness we and others did get out of the ABM treaty and did build missile defenses. We did this with a number of other treaties that we were told made us almost into a rogue state. For example, in 1999, the US Senate voted to defeat the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which would have banned any testing of nuclear weapons. Defeated it by a vote of 51 to 48. We've never become a member of it. It was the first time since 1919, when the Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, that the Senate had rejected a major international agreement. And I might say, maybe somebody in the audience can help me here. I once ran across a quotation from Churchill that I've never been able to find again. I don't think I imagined it, but if any of you know of it, please help me with the source. Churchill, I think, once said, the only countries that abide by arms control agreements are countries with whom you don't have to have arms control treaties to begin with. This is a lesson I think we could all learn. Basically, what this comes down to in matters of national security and many others is the ability of sovereign nations to overrule international law or treaties when it's contrary to their national interest. It's my view that in secular matters now on earth, the only authority that governs the United States is the United States Constitution, not international law or anything else. Our highest authority is the Constitution, period. This has come up in our courts going back well over a century, where they made this very, very clear that a subsequent Congress could reject, overrule, modify earlier agreed upon treaties. And this came up particularly in a series of cases in the late 1890s and early 1900s, known collectively as the Chinese exclusion cases. They were, very interestingly, cases about immigration, an issue that is important for you here and for us in the United States. And that's where the Supreme Court first made it clear that treaties could be overruled by subsequent American legislation dealing with the immigration of many Chinese nationals to the United States. And I remember one quotation in one of those opinions. We talked about how many of the Chinese immigrants had come to the United States, they said, from the nearby English port of Hong Kong. Those were the days. So what is the problem in the United States today? What is the issue that we're facing when we think back to Margaret Thatcher conservatism or Ronald Reagan conservatism? And how does that affect what I've just been talking about? I think we're in a very dangerous and difficult period. We see it in a lot of U.S. domestic issues with the Trump administration. He recently agreed with the high-tech company Intel for the U.S. government to take a 10% equity ownership of that company. Now, this was done while Congress was in its summer recess. I'm only aware of one senator or House member who said anything about the U.S. being a 10% owner of Intel. It was Bernie Sanders, the socialist senator from Vermont who caucuses with the Democrats, who said he thought it was a great idea. Well, of course he did. He could only dream of a Democratic president who would try and do that. We've seen it in the assault, the ongoing assault on the Federal Reserve System. We've seen it in ballooning budget deficits and increases to the national debt and in a variety of other contexts. Now, this is largely internal problem for the United States, but it's examples of the philosophical incoherence, or better stated, lack of philosophy of the current administration. But internationally, as the world looks increasingly unstable, This is where we need to pierce through the idea that words on pieces of paper ultimately change conduct in an anarchic system. You've heard of the rules-based international order. People in the EU say it over and over again, as if you say the rules-based international order often enough, there will be one. Unfortunately, nobody gave Vladimir Putin the memo. I don't think Xi Jinping has read it either. Rules in the international order come from power, and hopefully that power is exercised by the world's democracies and not our adversaries. Our problem today in the United States is that while we're still pretty unilateral, this time we've got an administration whose wellsprings are not internationalist, but isolationist. And that's why there are, in my view, critical issues where even in this period, close US-UK relations are absolutely critical. For us, for the two of us, but for the West as a whole, until we get through this difficult period. Now, it's not going to be easy for the next 3.5 years. I have to say, in candor, I do think Prime Minister Starmer is off to a pretty good start in developing a relationship with Donald Trump. And since Trump sees international relations through the prism of the relations of state leaders, so if he has a good relationship with Vladimir Putin, as he thinks he does, then US-Russian relations are good. That's obviously oversimplified, but the personal relationship is a prerequisite. And I think the deployment of the invitation by King Charles for a state visit was a masterstroke of getting to Trump exactly where he lives. I remember very vividly when Queen Elizabeth gave him a state visit in the first term. We went to Buckingham Palace for the dinner, which is something fantastic, I have to say. If Trump could have, he just stayed there all night. So this is a way to get him feeling sympathetic. But I would also say, don't discount the kind of relationship that he has with Nigel Farage. He has known Farage now for about 8 years. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out in your complicated politics here, which I won't go into. You can educate me on what's happening. But here are the key points from the US-UK perspective. Number one, most important, defense, defense, defense. It is absolutely correct that in an increasingly unstable and dangerous world, we in NATO as a whole, but with all of our like-minded governments around the world, we need to spend more on defense. My own view is that we need to go back to something like the levels of defense spending during the Reagan years, 4, 5, 6% of GDP. NATO has recently fixed a 5% target. It's really 3.5%, but we've all got to do more because if we don't, the threats from the China-Russia axis, which I think is the gravest threat we all face for the rest of this century, will simply overwhelm us. This is difficult to see these kinds of budget increases that going to a 4 to 5% of GDP level would mean. But let's face it, the welfare state is not going to protect us from our foreign adversaries. And if we want adequate protection, our politicians are going to have to make some very difficult decisions. Whether they're prepared to or not, I don't know, but that's obviously the starting point. I hope it's not the end point, because if we don't have the defense capabilities, we'll be unable to withstand hegemonic aspirations by China, Russia, and others. Second, and this is an issue very much on your minds here, very much on our minds in America, is immigration. It's a key measure of sovereignty to have control over your own borders. My feeling on immigration is the U.S. should have more legal immigration, and we should have zero illegal immigration. I think the U.S. has always benefited from immigration. That's how we came to be a nation. That's where the concept of e pluribus unum has worked for us. The melting pot has worked. But we, the current citizens, make the decision who comes in, not people jumping in front of the line and disadvantaging others. And I don't need to go into this. I know all of you are familiar with the problems you face here, and I think across Europe, if they're honest about it. So in a period where the U.S. isn't quite leading the way it should, I think the U.K.'s role has to increase. Let me just mention quickly a few areas. The first is avoiding the confusion and overlap between the NATO alliance and the European Union as a provider of national security. If Europe wants to depend on the European Union for its defense, well, God bless them, but it's not going to work. And the extent to which the EU takes on a separate role inside NATO circles is the short road to making NATO far less effective. NATO is an alliance of independent countries. Thank God the United Kingdom is out of the European Union and can stand up in NATO and speak for itself and take the leadership position that it has taken ever since February the 24th, 2022, in opposing Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. That brings me to the second issue right in front of us today, and that is we cannot give up on Ukraine. I don't know what the administration in Washington is going to do next. I think we've been through a series of humiliations. We've watched Vladimir Putin essentially work his KGB magic on the president again in Alaska. He went to Anchorage saying there would be severe sanctions against Russia if there were no ceasefire, and came out of the meeting saying we don't need a ceasefire and we're not going to have any sanctions, which is where we are. And today in China, you can see that Putin and Xi Jinping and unfortunately Prime Minister Modi of India, whom President Trump has all but thrown back into the arms of the Russians and the Chinese, are talking closely while we're excluded from it. But Ukraine is critical for the security of Europe, and I just regret that the French and the Germans in April of 2008 at the Bucharest summit in Romania blocked George W. Bush's push to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO on an expedited basis. I think if Ukraine and Georgia, we might not have been able to get in quickly enough, but you don't get many laboratory experiments in international affairs, but it only took the Russians until August of 2008 to invade Georgia. It's clear, and Finland and Sweden have proven this point by abandoning 75 years of neutrality because they came to believe correctly that the only safe boundary in Europe is behind a NATO boundary. NATO is critical for all of us, and I watched President Trump at the Brussels summit in 2018 come within an inch of withdrawing from NATO. He hasn't forgotten it, despite the recently successful NATO summit. There's a big responsibility, I think, here to keep the notion of American withdrawal closely cabined. We also now have this enormous problem, probably the worst self-inflicted wound in contemporary American history, that we have declared trade war on the rest of the world. You know, if we had wanted to go after China, which is the worst actor in international trade, we could have gotten all of our friends and allies to say, you know, we too have been victimized by intellectual property theft, unfair competition by the Chinese. Why don't we get together and all pressure the Chinese and see if we can change that behavior? But instead, we've declared war on our top trading partners and friends. This is causing enormous damage to the United States, not just economically, but by ripping up decades of effort to build trust and reliance and good faith in the United States, just being handled in the White House by ad hoc decisions day after day, which never achieve stability. China, as I said before, is really the big issue, and here the United Kingdom has already made a significant commitment a few years ago that may be in jeopardy in Washington, and that's AUKUS, the Australian, UK, US agreement to produce nuclear-powered submarines for the Australian Navy. I have to give the Biden administration credit. I never thought they would have accepted something like this. But I give the prior British government great credit too for saying this is so important to tie the nations of the Atlantic with the nations of the Pacific. Because if, as I've said, there is a Sino-Russian axis growing, it's a worldwide threat. And the idea that NATO can act separately from the like-minded countries in the Asian Pacific region is just wrong. That's why I'm so worried about the damage that has been done to the Asian security quad, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, driving Modi, as I said before, back toward Russia. I hope that can be repaired. I think the quad can be expanded. I've recommended South Korea's membership. I think the UK and members from other parts of the world could consider coming in it too. We looked at this a long time ago, and it made sense then, and it makes sense now. I've talked about the way the U.S. Conservatives looked at the International Criminal Court, the law of the sea court, the World Trade Organization dispute resolution mechanism. Here, you've got the European Court of Human Rights as your particular problem at the moment. It is unacceptable from a point of fundamental democratic theory that these courts, over which you have zero control, exercise any influence over this country at all. Leave aside the immigration question. Getting out of the European Court of Human Rights was a critical part of Brexit. It recalls colonies which returned, former colonies of Great Britain returning their judicial system back from the House of Lords. The House of Lords in Brussels has still got part of yours, and it ought to be rejected at the earliest point. Let me just conclude by saying, so great, you've raised a lot of problems here tonight. What are the answers? It takes a little bit longer to do, but I can tell you what the fundamental point is, and that is we have to return to Reaganism and Thatcherism. This was the most glorious period of our mutual recent history, and by that I mean return to the philosophies of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, not a cult of personality for anybody, but their philosophies, which guided us so well and will do so again in the future. Thank you very much.